please welcome Narayan V to the front.
Thank you very much for those kind words, and a very warm welcome once again to the Adelphi, to all of you. What I'd like to do in the few minutes that we have is really just reflect a little bit on what all of this stuff means from the perspective of ACCA. Many of you will probably be aware, but fundamentally, we're an education body. We're there to train accountancy and finance professionals. Where does that connect with finance? Where does that connect with real estate finance, sustainability, and all of this stuff? What I'd like to do, first of all, is just to contextualize what we mean when we talk about the accountancy profession. So you can go from very, very narrow, which is, here's how much money we made last year, report, to something which is a lot more expansive than that. And that is the vision that we have for what we think we can do. We've got about 250,000 members around the world. We're training about 500,000 students around the world. So we believe that if we teach people the right things, we have the scale to make a difference in the world. So it's really important that we look at these things from that perspective of building resilient economies, developing talent, sustainability. The role of the public sector is clearly critical from a top-down perspective in terms of what governments can do. But equally, the role of SMEs is really critical from a bottom-up perspective. In any economy, the bulk of businesses by volume are going to be SMEs. So if you're going to make a difference at that level, you're going to change economies. So what we find is, running through all of those things, particularly around strengthening ethics and trust, we see overlaps with the world of doing things in a sustainable manner. And when we think about that in the context of some of the things we're discussing here, one of the things I wanted to start out with is, first of all, thinking about where we see risks for the type of scenarios that we're talking about. So when we listen to our members and we listen to what they're telling us, clearly there are two very big areas around physical risks and transition risks. So in terms of the actual natural catastrophe and other physical risks that were mentioned earlier, but also transition risks in terms of things like legal risk and also reputation risk. A long time ago, before I transitioned into the education sector, I used to work in financial services in Canary Wharf, not very far from here, and I remember walking over the bodies of a bunch of activists from I'm not going to say which organization, because the American bank that I was working for at the time was funding a highly controversial dam in an Asian country that I won't name. So the bottom line is that these things have real reputational impact if they're not managed properly. Of course, there are much bigger imperatives as well, and there are very good reasons why one needs to do these things for their own sake. But there are also very sound business, reputational, and legal reasons for doing so. The second point there around reporting standards, I think, is also really important for our constituency. I say that primarily because when we think about the direction of reporting, and ultimately we want, I'm very sure all of us in this room want to do the right thing, but in order to do the right thing, you need to be able to measure whether you're doing the right thing or not. In order to be able to measure that, you need to have some kind of benchmark or basis for measurement. And the accountancy and finance world has a lot of very good, deep, long-standing skills to offer in that space. There are bodies like the International Sustainability Standards Boards that have been recently created. And one of the hopes and the direction of travel of that body is to create a globally consistent way of looking at some of these things, or at least to the extent possible, a globally consistent way of doing that. And I think that will be really, really critical. We've seen attempts to do something similar. ACCA of globally harmonized financial reporting standards wherever possible, and we will continue to be, in terms of some of the new, for those of you who are close to it, many of you may be, the S1 and S2 standards as they're called. The idea is for these to form foundational elements on the basis of which a lot of our understanding of what actually is happening on the ground is measured. We can't talk about whether greenwashing is happening or not if we don't have a consistent language and a consistent basis to do that. I'd also like to just note that we're in an international world. The environment is an international issue. And so even if certain standards and certain things or local regulatory standards are occurring, it's increasingly the case that a company that's operating in one jurisdiction will be affected by something that's happening in the other. And in this sense, climate is probably not that dissimilar from the other big disruptive conversation of our time, which is probably artificial intelligence. But coming back to the broader point there around risk management as well, as it's noted there, the one thing I'd say there is what we are seeing in terms of the training that we're offering to our members and the sort of professionals that we want them to become. The importance of scenarios cannot be overemphasized. Clearly, all of us wish we had an oracle and we could predict, but since none of us can, the next best option is a scenario. And I think being able to look at situations through a variety of scenarios and being able to price those in some way, I think your point initially around not being able to price certain types of risks anymore, I think is really, really valid and an important one. And I think those are the sort of things where increasingly our ability to be able to look at the world through multiple possibilities and in a much more probabilistic way than perhaps we have done, from a more deterministic way to a much more probabilistic way, I think it is going to be essential, certainly for our profession, but more broadly for society as well. And I think decision making, where we're seeing a lot of the kind of skill sets that are coming through and the things that we need to teach more and more, is around how we plan for unknown unknowns and how we plan specifically in the context of business continuity planning. And I think those are all things that we increasingly see are a much broader canvas for what was historically a perhaps viewed as a much more narrow financial accounting profession, which is very much not the case in terms of the reality of what people are doing in their jobs these days. So we would, it was initially introduced as lives and livelihoods, and I talked a little bit about lives, but I just wanted to reflect a bit on livelihoods as well, because when you think about adapting the workforce, I mean, things are changing at a phenomenal pace, and the creation of green jobs, restructuring of industries. I mean, this very location where we're standing, where we're sitting right now, I've been working in this office for many, many years, and 3 years ago, ACCA's office in this very building was actually quite different. We had 2 floors. Now we've got just this 1 floor. We have a much smaller number of individual desks and a much larger number of collaborative working spaces. All of this is indicative of the fact that we're working in a different way, we're collaborating in a different way, and we need to think, even from a real estate perspective, about office space in a very different way. Clearly, all of you will be very familiar with some of these narratives, but certainly from my perspective, I've seen it in a very real way in my own workspace, so it's something that really hits home. And I think underlying all of this is my earlier point around skills, and we have a fairly elaborate skills matrix in terms of what we think are important for accountancy and finance professionals to be able to do. What you will not see very clearly on that chart is how to do financial reporting, how to do an audit. It's there, it's embedded in the text, but what you actually see at the center of that grid is sustainability. And we feel very strongly that ultimately, if we cannot create a sustainable finance function and a sustainable financing alternative, then a lot of the other things will just fall down one way or another. Now, very quickly, in the interest of time, we were talking a little bit about ESG as well, and the S in ESG is clearly a really important driver of a lot of our thinking. The social agenda is something that is coming into play as a result of cascading risks, clearly. So as a result of international migration, as a result of natural disasters, as a result of a whole lot of things around embedded inequities. Now, ACCA by itself is not the body to be able to solve for all of these things, but what we can do is bring our global network to bear. What we can do is ensure that what we learn in one part of the world, we transfer to another. What we can do is ensure that we, as Helen was mentioning in the earlier video, stay true, or as true as we can, to our commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals. There's a whole bunch of them, there are 17 of them, and that's already a lot. And in order to avoid spreading ourselves in a sensible way, we've picked these 9 and we're trying to focus organizationally across all of them. Some will not be surprised around quality education, but then there are very important points around gender, very important points around a whole bunch of things around quality of work. And we feel that ultimately all of these things, even though they seem very remote from a direct financing agenda, are actually extremely important in order to be able to create meaningful work for people. So what I would just like to say is that from an ACCA perspective, as far as possible, we would like to ensure that we are walking the talk. we've got about 57 offices around the world, and inevitably those will have, we've got members in about 200 countries around the world. We've got 57 offices around the world. They have their own carbon footprint. We have a fairly, for a body which is not a huge multinational corporation, we have a fairly complex supply chain, and particularly in terms of emissions, scope 3, and the wider supply chain, it's not always entirely straightforward. So we are engaging very actively in terms of how we think about what we're doing ourselves and embedding that into our strategy. We are hoping to reduce our carbon emissions by 50% by 2030. We're hoping to reach net zero by 2045, so that's the goal that we've set ourselves. And we believe in transparency. We have an integrated report. We set out where we are, and we welcome people to question us about it, and we do our best to try and stay true to it. And ultimately, we feel that in terms of what we say externally, whether it's, for example, at COP28, we're very actively involved in representing the profession at these kind of major global events. It's probably fair to say that these things are not entirely new. I was talking a little earlier to Sadi, I think we were just referring to a long time ago, I think it was about 15 years ago. Do you need me to shut up? A long time ago, about 15 years ago, I was actually doing some project work for the IFC in Vietnam, and I remember at the time, I don't know if it's because I've been away from that word for a bit, but there used to be these things called the Equator Principles, and it was all about, okay, so it's still there, you're nodding. So, and I think, the quality of the thinking has always been extremely high, and I think increasingly I'm really pleased to see that, the conversation is much more about the monitoring and the implementation, and I think the patience of society will not last for much longer to keep things at the principles level. So I think we're all, and I think the accountancy and finance profession contains people who are essentially at the cold face of risk, governance, internal control, who would actually be delivering some of that monitoring, some of that evaluation within companies around the world. So I really look forward to continuing this discussion and to hopefully, in whatever way ACCA can, to support all of you in this really important discussion. Thank you very much.